Welcome to Highline's Help for Abused Spouses podcast, Breaking the Silence, bringing domestic violence and sexual assault into the light. On today's episode, we continue talking with Angela Mastrovito, whose daughter Rebekah disappeared in Missoula, Montana in July of 2021. Even now, almost 4 years later, there are still so many unanswered questions regarding Rebekah's disappearance. Please show your support for ending domestic violence by following Rebekah's Facebook page, Rebekah's Legacy, Justice for Rebekah. Help put an end to domestic violence.
The following podcast may contain discussion of domestic and/or sexual violence, stalking, suicide, and PTSD. There is also the possibility of strong language that may be inappropriate for young listeners. Highline's Help acknowledges that our parties mentioned in this podcast are innocent until proven guilty by a court of law, and all statements are the opinions of the guests. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by guest speakers are those of the guests and do not necessarily reflect the view of Highline's Help for Abused Spouses or any of its funders, employees, or board members.
Okay, so we talked about the things that they found on the beach that you don't believe was like her shirt or whatever.
Right. I don't believe it was her shirt. There was a lanyard and a leash that were placed straight out. Okay. And there were flip-flops, there was a hat, there was sunglasses. They say, and when I say they, Mineral County Sheriff's Department, say that it was a girl rescue dog scenario. That's what they say.
Okay, and how did they come to that conclusion?
Because Rebekah had her dog at the river, and they say the dog went into the river and got distressed, and Rebekah went running in after it. Now, this is a Belgian Malinois.
Oh, okay.
Belgian Malinois are very strong dogs.
They are. They're very high maintenance.
Yes.
Incredibly strong personalities.
Yes. Rebekah was always out walking with sirs and throwing frisbees and toys and stuff like that. So, yeah, they are high maintenance. And so that's their scenario. But there's a lot of problems and there's a lot of questions with that scenario, because along with the shirt, the hat, the baseball cap, the flip-flops were her driver's license and a credit card that were lined perfectly side by side. You could have not lined them up any better with a ruler. So let's walk through this. Rebekah always wore sunglasses outside. She was blue-eyed. She also had a nevus, which is like a freckle on your iris. Typically nothing to be concerned about, but through the years, the sun can alter the cell tissue of that, and then it does become something to worry about. So she always wore sunglasses outside. So if you're at the riverbank and your dog goes in the water and it's distressed, you're not going to take the time to take your driver's license and your credit card out of your back pocket of your jeans. You're not going to, if you're always wearing sunglasses and you're looking out on the water, there's going to be a glare if you take your sunglasses off, which is going to blind you. So Rebekah's not going to throw her hat and her sunglasses off to jump into the water. If your dog's in distress, it's in distress, and you're going to jump in. You're not going to take anything off. So to me, that scenario just doesn't fly. Also, the dog knew how to swim. And if it did get in distress, it would, from all the different experiments we did with logs, with milk jugs filled with water, to like up to 150 pounds is what they did. It would go out into the river and then go around the rock. And they all came up on the other side of the rock on the riverbank. And the rest of the water was actually low enough in places that you could literally walk across it. Okay? So somebody would have seen a dog tumbling on the river. Nobody saw Rebekah there, at least nobody that's come forward. Nobody saw the dog. And I find that really hard to believe, that when you have a Belgian Malinois that they're majestic.
Yeah, they are.
They're very majestic. They're powerful in stature. That nobody noticed a girl walking a Belgian Malinois.
Right.
And it's a populated area. It was 95 degrees that day. It was sunny. It was hot. People go there all the time. And I don't buy it. I don't buy it because it would appear things were laid out. My husband and I fully believe it was staged.
Okay.
I mean, that's our opinion.
Right.
We believe it's staged. We really, if you look at how things were lined up on the beach compared to nobody being there, nobody seeing Rebekah, and the sheriff's department saying, girl rescue dog, it was an accidental drowning. They don't have proof.
No.
They don't have any proof. And so our theory has just as much value as their theory.
Right.
As far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
But then when you throw in text messages from her husband that say, I'm going to kill the dog, kill you, drive your truck in the river, and set the house on fire, that's circumstantial evidence. When you have other forms of communication or other people saying, yes, there was domestic violence, when you have documentation of domestic violence, when you have an active PFMA charge, when you have video footage and still shots of somebody stalking Rebekah and looking into her trailer, when you have YouTube videos on Rebekah's phone in her history of her trying to figure out how do you find out if somebody's stalking you or tracking you, when you have all these different things that add up to circumstantial evidence, I agree. To me, it just throws it into a position of where you should at least look at it and consider it and process it through.
Right.
And investigate it.
Yeah.
You have death threats to the parents, one in Montana and one to burn the house down in Virginia. So if this is a river accident, why are there death threats? Also, too, why was it so important to call it a river accident from the onset? And one of the questions that we asked the detectives was, is there an insurance policy? And they asked me that. And I said, I have no idea. So I called Montana insurance commissioners, and they say, we can't talk to you about that. This is an active case. This was early on. This was in September, August or September. And so when Missoula County passed it back to Mineral County, I asked them, I said, did you follow up? Oh, no, we never heard back. A year later, August of 2022, the private investigator gets a phone call saying, did you know there's a $250,000 accidental death policy on Rebekah? Payable only upon accidental death. And I did write to the Montana Insurance Commissioner again. I listed everything. I listed all my questions. I held nothing back. And I heard back, and they said they would investigate it. But what they didn't tell me was that they had already issued the money to David. Well, and actually, it wasn't issued directly to David. There was a third party that was listed as the beneficiary, not David.
Oh, how convenient.
Yeah. And it gets a little bit more interesting because the third party worked at the caregiver agency that provided the caregivers to David.
I'll be darned.
So it gets a little bit more interesting.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
It does. And, when we go back to, the dog was in trouble. When you say the water was not that deep in places where you could actually walk across it.
Right.
And again, this breed of dog is incredibly strong dogs. Most dogs know how to swim. You throw them in the water and they're gonna swim.
Yeah.
I would guess that she did this quite a bit with this dog, that she would take the dog, go to the water with him.
So Rebekah sent me a video on July 1st, because she said, I'm taking him to the river. And she sent me a video of July 1st of him in the river water swimming. And she does say on July 1st, first time in the water, good boy, good boy. And he's just going to town. But from then on, it was her practice for them when they went on walks to swim in the river as well.
Okay.
So it wouldn't have been his first time in the river.
So was she a good swimmer?
Rebekah was a swimmer. Like, she wasn't like Olympic swimmer, but Rebekah was raised on the water. She would go to her grandfather's house every year, who had a boat and a swimming pool. She was always in the boat and always in the swimming pool. She would participate in swimming activities, but I mean, as far as like, not an Olympic swimmer, but
right.
She knew how
just,
to swim.
She could swim.
Yeah, she could swim. Now, the funny part is that David did try to paint the picture that she was unable to swim. And he actually started trying to paint that picture almost a year before, because he said that they were in their new house and the dogs had gone on the water, and Rebekah went in the water, and that she thought that one of the dogs was in distress and that he had to rescue Rebekah. But this is disabled veteran who's an invalid.
Yeah, that has to have 24-hour care.
That has to have 24/7 care, that had to be able to rescue Rebekah. So he was already starting to try to cast doubt and to create a story.
So he's using the word
narrative.
Distressed from that. So law enforcement then uses the same type of language to describe what they perceive as could have happened.
Right.
That the dog was in distress, and
right.
So she went in after, and then they were both swept down the river where you could actually walk across it.
And they did find the dog 6 days later, 10 miles downriver. I had never seen the dog alive, so I couldn't identify the dog, that it was specifically Sir's. There was a collar on, but that doesn't mean anything. And there was a shock collar on. Now, my husband actually thinks that Sir's was shocked to death. They did use a shock collar for training, but we also know how they used that shock collar for training because we had one of their German Shepherds. And so they used the sound and the vibrate. The shock they never used because it would take them down for 30 seconds, and it takes them another 30 seconds to recover.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Shock is that?
Yeah, it's that bad. So when the dog was taken to the SPCA or whatever their local organization is in Missoula, they provided me with the collar and the ashes, but they didn't return the shock collar. And so I called and I said, where's the shock collar? And they said, well, we couldn't get that off because it was embedded in the dog. And I'm thinking, the dog's dead. I mean, this sounds terrible, but the dog's dead and it was frozen and you could have yanked that sucker out. Right. Where is it? My husband seems to think that that the dog had been shocked enough that the prongs literally burned into the tissue and became embedded that way in the tissue. But we'll never know that.
No.
We'll never know that. But that's what we
that
think.
Theory isn't any worse than the theory that law enforcement has come up with.
Correct.
So, I mean, it makes more sense.
And it makes more sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know that because one time I hit the wrong button on our German Shepherd by mistake. And I freaked out. I was like, oh my God, And so I know how it works. But then when you get the manual and you look at it and it tells you, like it is a 30-second disarm in the nervous system. And then it takes them another 30 seconds to snap out, more or less, depending on the dog, I guess, and the intensity of the shock. Because you can raise and lower the volume of the shock. Okay. So where it's just like a tiny, like on a TENS unit that you would use in PT, or you can make it more.
Yeah.
So anyways, that was our theory. And we asked about doing a necropsy, on the dog. Sheriff Toth actually published that a necropsy was done. A necropsy was never done. And the dog was cremated without the necropsy.
The dog was cremated under whose authority?
Well, I was the only one that went to the SPCA. David did not go. And I didn't know, I mean, I'm in shock. I didn't know what to do. And so I'm like, if they're not going to do a necropsy and I don't know what to tell you, I guess cremate the dog.
Okay.
You know? I mean, so that was
That was something you made a decision.
That was something I made a decision on, and it was a very poor decision made under extreme emotional duress.
Well, if you got the ashes and if they kept the collar on when they cremated it, would there not be pieces of this collar in the ashes?
I don't know, and David got the ashes because David's the personal representative. David also got Rebekah's ashes because he's the personal representative. I don't know what he did with Service's box, but she's buried in his backyard. Rebekah's buried in his backyard.
So you said the dog was found how many days later?
6 days.
6 days after she was reported missing. Now, you said he was froze?
Well, they put him at the SPCA or whatever.
They froze him. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and there was no, other than this collar being,
right. There was the collar and the shock collar.
The shock collar. There were no other signs of trauma to the dog.
I mean, I'm not of that, but not that I could.
Nothing that they had.
They said there were no gun. They took 2 X-rays. They said there were no gunshot wounds and no stabs.
And you said how many miles down the river?
10 miles.
10 miles down the river. Then when did they find Rebekah?
So, body was found on May 17th, 2022. Oddly enough, we had just left Montana to visit my husband's sister in Arizona.
So how long were you actually in Montana?
I was in Montana from July 23rd, and then Jerry drove out because you couldn't get a rental car because of COVID. So he was out the next week. And then we were in Montana until May 14th or 15th.
Okay, so, and the year was
2022.
When you came?
No, when I came out to Montana, it was July 23rd, 2021. And we stayed until May, I think it was 13th or 14th of 2022. We left with the intention to just go for, 1 or 2 weeks to visit family, try to get a break from all the chaos and the turmoil. And so we left to visit family, and then on the 17th, I got a phone call. So there's a lot of questions around that, too. Did somebody know we left?
Yeah.
We'd been there all that time. They'd done extensive river searches. Coot and I did a search. Flathead did a search. Wings of Hope did a search, all in August. Wings of Hope came back out in October to do a Clark Fork River search for another young man that had gone missing. And then they came back out in March for a whole month. We hired them to come out to do a private search. So they searched probably, I think it was 124 river miles. They went up past the Alberton Gorge, which was above the place where people think Rebekah went in. And they went all the way down to Thompson Falls, where there's a dam. And they searched it with sonar, drones, divers, and cadaver dogs. And they just didn't do it once. They did it multiple times. And they went both sides. They worked from one side and then did, over to the other side. And in March 15th, Brad and Keith came to us. We were staying at a hotel in St. Regis so we could be closer to the search sites because Missoula was an hour away. They came to the hotel and they said, we really hate to tell you this, but it's our experience that by now, if we find your daughter, she's going to be in pieces. So I need you to know that what we're doing is very tedious and that we're looking in pockets where we think we see a grease spot or the dogs might alert. And he said, and if we hit a place like that, we will put our diver in. And he said, I don't know how else to tell you this, but I have to let you know. So when we get a call in May that there's a whole body intact, we were rather surprised. We were surprised with other things about it because they said that it was the whole conversations were mixed where the body was placed. And then I'm going, what do you mean placed? You know, I mean, who placed it there?
Right.
That the right hand was skeletonized, meaning that all the skin was removed to the bone. Well, why just the right hand? They said they couldn't tell if it was Rebekah or not from visual, that she would have to go to the state crime lab. In the meantime, there was another woman missing from Mineral County that nobody was talking about, Melissa Arnold. And she had gone missing 4 years before. Wings of Hope was not informed that she was missing. Nobody was talking about her missing. Wings of Hope had specifically asked, are there any other women missing? So they were not informed. Wings of Hope did find clothing, but because they didn't know about Melissa Arnold, I don't know what happened to that clothing, but they specifically called and asked me, is this something Rebekah would wear? What size did she wear? And it wasn't anything that matched Rebekah. So I don't know what happened to it. Sheriff Toth said they found clothing on the river all the time, and they couldn't assume that just because they found clothing on the river all the time, that it was related to a missing person. That was the other comment that Sheriff Toth had made at one point. But they said they found a body in spandex shorts and a sports bra that had geometric designs. The day Rebekah went missing, she was in jean shorts and a cotton tank top with cut-in sleeves to the neckline. It almost appeared as though there was no bra.
Okay.
You know, I mean, it was that type of shirt. I'm thinking Rebekah would not wear spandex shorts underneath jean shorts on a 95-degree day. And from the description of the bra, Rebekah's sports bras were navy blue, black, gray, white, and they were the thick ones with the thick straps. So I'm like, she didn't have any geometric sports bras that I knew of or that I found anything close to that in similarity when we were in her trailer. And I had seen pictures of her working out, and they were blue gym shorts and the blue sports bra, but that's not attire Rebekah would wear out. In fact, Rebekah has a very dear friend, and I asked Philip, I said, what do you know or think about this? He said, Rebekah's birth name was Rose, and that's how he remembers me. And he'd go, Miss Rose. He goes, I'd be seen out in public in black spandex before Rebekah would be. So, anyways, I immediately went to, if this body is Rebekah's, there's no outhouse at mile marker 72. There's nowhere to change. It's 95 degrees. It's well populated. She's not going to take the time to change in her car with the heat that hot. And I'm thinking, so what happened? Did she really go missing on the 20th? Or did something else happen, and was she abducted and something else happened? Because she wouldn't have, that's not what she had on when she went missing. She didn't have the black spandex on when she went missing. She had the jean shorts. And Sheriff Ryan Funk seems to think that Rebekah died immediately. That's what he wrote on the autopsy and the death certificate, immediate. So if he thinks she died immediately, how did she have time to change clothes when she went in the water?
And where are those clothes
And
she
where-
took off?
And where are those clothes that she took off? Where are they? They weren't listed on any inventory for the vehicle, and they weren't at the shore at the riverbank with the other items. So a lot of questions.
Yeah.
A lot of questions. They said that they could not identify the body by DNA, that it was not amplifiable. I have asked the state crime lab, what does that mean? Why could you not amplify DNA? You can amplify DNA from a dinosaur bone from 2,000 years ago. You can get DNA from a body that has been found out in environment 10 years ago, and you can identify the body, and it's just a piece of the bone. It's not in the whole body. So why can't you identify? I never got an answer. They also, I also questioned, well, the body was intact enough that you could get a toxicology report.
Yeah.
So why could you not amplify DNA? Those things don't make any sense to me.
And you said the toxicology report came back.
The only two substances found in Rebekah's body were caffeine and THC. And it was, according to my attorney, it was a mass spectrometry toxicology exam, which at the time, it may have been improved upon by now, 3 years later, but at the time, it was the best. It was like the Cadillac of toxicology exams.
Okay.
And it was a qualitative study for presence. So it could only measure presence in the system. It could not determine amounts. So it could only say these substances were present enough to say they were there.
Okay.
That's all it could say. And I have a copy of that report, so I know what it says. So I questioned that. I also asked the pathologist at the state crime lab to study for bugs, an entomology exam. Actually, the search and rescue team told me to ask for that from Wings of Hope. And the response I got back was there were none.
There were none?
There were none. And I specifically asked for an entomology exam to identify either land or water bugs. I wanted to encompass it all, right? If she'd been in the water for 10 and a half months, there should have been some water bugs in an orifice somewhere.
Right.
Or an open skin area or something. And I was told there were none. So that tells me either they didn't do a thorough job in their assessment, or they were unwilling to report any, or if there truly weren't any, then how was she in the water for 10 and a half months and found on land? And it doesn't take that long for insects and microbes from land to gravitate to the body.
A body, yeah.
It doesn't take that long. Since they weren't allowed, since they couldn't identify by DNA, they said they identified by dental records, which Sheriff Toth said I withheld. But in all actuality, I was the only one who went and got the dental records and make sure they were registered with NamUs. And Rebekah had 3 sets of dental records from 3 different dentists in 2 years. And her last x-ray of a full panel x-ray was taken 2 weeks before she went missing. And she had a full set. And she was missing teeth. The body was missing teeth on recovery. So I questioned that. And if you're missing a lot of teeth, I don't know how you identify with teeth. And I asked questions and nobody wants to answer them. That's the problem. I'm like, if you don't have anything to hide, why don't you answer the questions? Why can't you be upfront and honest about it? If you don't have any, if you don't have anything to hide, just answer the question.
Well, you mentioned that they made a comment about how the body was placed.
Yeah. So in conversation, and at the time it was Deputy Funk, he said where the body was placed. And I'm like, placed? What do you mean placed? And I don't know if it was a Freudian slip. I don't know. There's been a lot of Freudian slips. And I don't know if it was a Freudian slip, but he corrected himself real quick.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Where did...
No, that's not what I really meant.
Yeah, that's not what I really meant. Yeah. So
but she was out of the water when they found her.
Well, so that's an issue too, because in the police report submitted to the state crime lab, and I asked Dr. Prashar at the state crime lab, how do you determine a drowning? And he said, it's solely on the police report, based on their police report. The police report says that Rebekah was last seen in the river.
By who?
That's what we'd like to know. But everything documented on missing person flyers, and even the missing person flyer created by Mineral County Sheriff's Department, says last seen at Town Pump in Superior on dry land. Now, it doesn't say on dry land, but Town Pump sits on dry land.
Yeah.
And the parking lot is on dry land. And the body was found on the riverbank. I think almost 30. And that might be 30 river miles. But
Cerberus was 10.
And Cerberus was 10. Maybe 26 to 30, if I remember right. And I didn't get the autopsy report until after we had requested a second autopsy to be done by a private pathologist, which the court mandated. But what I have found is that when you request a second autopsy, you have to be very, very specific about what you want. You have to specifically ask, and I didn't know this, and neither did my attorney apparently. You need to not only ask for the day of recovery photographs, you have to ask for the photographs taken during the first autopsy. You have to ask for the x-rays taken from the first autopsy. You have to ask for availability to tissue samples that may have been held for future testing. And you have to ask for all the reports. We failed to ask for all those things.
And your attorney never thought to do that?
I guess not. I mean, he asked for x-rays and reports, but he didn't think, and he didn't, I don't know that he's ever asked for a second autopsy. So, and that's where, like, I still had a good relationship with the state crime lab. And that's where I would have hoped their representative would have said, these are the items you need to ask for if you want a second autopsy. They already knew there were a lot of questions about Rebekah's disappearance.
Yeah.
They already knew there were a lot of questions about the event. So it seems to me they would have been more than happy to help alleviate any further questions if they could.
Yeah, I would think so.
And then the other strange thing that occurred was that after the body was found, a representative from the state of Montana was on a Zoom call at a hearing. And if I remember correctly, the gist of the statement was that the state crime lab would not be held responsible. There would be no liability to the state crime lab involving Rebekah's case. And I'm thinking, okay, we haven't had the body identified yet. And I'm trying to figure out why it's necessary to say this statement. But when you're in a courtroom, it's not like on TV, and you don't get an opportunity to say anything.
Right.
Unless if the judge gives you permission.
Right.
And if the judge doesn't give you permission, he can throw you out. So it's very different than what you see on TV. And so, I mean, that statement was made, it was presented, it's on a transcript of the hearing that day. And I did not understand why it was necessary. But then later on, as things play out, my attorney made a motion in a filing that the body be preserved, meaning frozen, because there was a second autopsy to be performed. And that if it was compromised in preservation, that we would lose any opportunity at all to either confirm or deny the first autopsy findings. There was one roadblock after another. I had permission to get a second autopsy, but every pathologist I found wanted the body shipped to them. And we were willing to do that, but Mineral County was not willing to release the body. So I had to find a pathologist that was willing to come to Montana. So the state crime lab gave me the name of a pathologist that used to work for them and then left and did consulting nationally. I had delayed calling Dr. Bennett, it's Dr. Tom Bennett, just because everything else was like so connected. And I'm like, yeah, I got this name from the state crime lab. I'm not sure about this. I'm trying to find somebody not related to Montana, but I was running out of time. And of course, even I'm thinking in my head, okay, the court's done what it's done. The state crime lab has done what it's done. They've honored this motion and the body is frozen. And I couldn't have been further from the truth. They only refrigerated the body and they triple bagged the body. And typically a body is only single bagged. And so by refrigerating the body and not freezing the body, they did not preserve the body. And so that's why the representative from the state had come on and said the state crime lab will not have any liability in this case.
Wow.
Before any of that, the body had been found. It had been housed or garaged or kept at the state crime lab. David was primarily awarded personal representative because I was accused of, by his attorney, that I was going to take the body. That's in a court document, and that was filed with the courts. And I'm like, it's under lock and key at the state crime lab, unless if I happen to have connections and know somebody who can get me in there and get this body back to Virginia without anybody knowing. And the reality of it was I was calling everybody. I was calling pathologists from California, Washington State, Oregon State, Idaho, Wyoming. The furthest east I had gone was Chicago, Illinois, because there was a pathologist in Chicago, Illinois that was an expert in water deaths.
Mm.
You know, and that was the furthest east I had gone. And I had said, no, I'm not going to go west. I'm not going to go east because I don't want them to think something stupid's going to happen. I will stay on the West Coast. But he could have only gotten that information from Deputy Funk, because Deputy Funk is the one who called me to inform me about the body found on the 17th of May. And I asked Deputy Funk, what happens now? He said, well, the body will go to the state crime lab. And I said, well, but what happens after that? David and Rebekah are still married. Do I have a say? He said, well, I would talk to your attorney. But in the motion filed to the courts by Julie Sears, David's attorney, it says that David was informed I was going to attempt to confiscate or obtain the body and have it released to me. So she was at the courthouse early Monday or the morning of the 18th and filed a motion for personal representative that did not go to the judge. It was only filed by the clerk to the clerk of the court and signed.
Not by the judge?
Not by the judge. It was signed by the clerk of the court. So we kept submitting motions and filings to object, and Judge Marks just disregarded them, never acknowledged them. When we did get the autopsy report, they didn't release the first autopsy report to me until after the second autopsy was done. I didn't have the second autopsy report yet, but they released the first autopsy report to me. I called my attorney and I said, when do I get the first autopsy report? And he goes, well, you should have it. I said, I do not have it. Nobody has ever given it to me. They said in court I wouldn't get it until after the second autopsy was done. Second autopsy was done Friday. This is Monday. When do I get the autopsy? So he sent it to me. I had questions galore. There were tattoos in the wrong place. Rebekah grew an inch. The reason I said, how does a dead body grow an inch? And the reason I was given was that it's really hard to measure a dead body. And I said, excuse me, I'm a nurse that's worked in a pediatric office trying to measure a wiggly 18-month-old that does not sit still. And if I can measure something that wiggles and gets an accurate height, you should be able to get an accurate height on a dead body that doesn't move. There were multiple teeth missing. There was no hair on the body. because I asked if they could do a hair analysis. And I was told there was no hair. And the other thing I asked, if I remember right, was in chemotherapy and cancer patients, there's a process called cryotherapy. And it's an ice cap that goes on the head to help keep the patient from losing their hair. It maintains the hair follicles. The cold process does. It retards the release of the hair follicle. That when they said there was no hair, and actually there's a contradictory there, because it says average length of hair on the autopsy is 1/2 inch in length, but I was told there was no hair when I asked to do a hair analysis. But cryotherapy is very successful in getting the body to understand to hold on to the hair follicle. And so my question was, if cryotherapy is so successful, then if this body was in the cold water of the Clark Fork River during the winter, why was the hair released? Why did the follicle release the hair? But then, like I said, there's a contradictory there, because I received a statement that said there was no hot hair, but on the autopsy it says average length of hair 1/2 inch. Now, Rebekah had long hair, longer than me, or about my length, and twice as full. I mean, she had like a horse's mane. She had beautiful, beautiful hair, and she had it in pigtails the day she went missing. So we hired the second pathologist. He said he extracted 3 teeth for future DNA forensics. And it was my intention to find a lab that would work with the family privately and run mitochondrial DNA, since they couldn't run DNA on the body. And I found a lab, a mitotyping lab in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and they were willing to work with me as the family. Let's see, Dr. Bennett did his autopsy, I think July 22nd or 23rd of 2022. Okay. He sent me the report in August, and it lists 3 teeth extracted for future DNA forensics. So I asked him, I said, who has the teeth? And he says, well, I do. And I said, okay. I said, how do I find a lab that will process this? And he said, well, you're just going to have to call around. So I just started looking up labs online and calling. I called Mexico. I called Canada. I called the United States. Most of the companies required the police to request it.
Oh, okay.
That was my dilemma. Mitotyping did not. And they receive specimens from all over the world. They typically work with families because it's their last hope. I must have talked to Gloria for an hour and a half, 2 hours, because I had so many questions. She was so gracious. She said that it would take possibly 6 to 9 months once they received the tooth, to process for the DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, that it was a very lengthy process. So I said, well, we've waited this long. I can wait another 9 months, after you get it. So we contracted with mitotyping, paid them, got all the necessary forms and the information on how to send the teeth to them. I emailed them to Dr. Bennett. I called Dr. Bennett. I texted Dr. Bennett multiple times. I'm out of town. I'm doing an autopsy in California. I'm doing an autopsy in Hawaii. I'm doing an autopsy in Oregon, just multiple times. And so I said, well, who's in charge of your office? Who keeps your specimens? And he goes, well, I just moved from Wyoming to Nevada. And he goes, I'll be home in whatever month it was. I think it was January, and I'll look for them. So I'm like, okay. I mean, I'm texting, not getting what I would consider good communication in response. I resent the forms. And then all of a sudden it's, well, I think the specimens are in Cody, Wyoming. or Basin, Wyoming, or here or there. And I'm like, what? You were the pathologist. These were supposed to be in your safekeeping. He just said the coroner at Basin, Wyoming lost them. So I kept trying to find out who's the coroner, who's the coroner, who's the coroner. So I called myself because he wouldn't give me any further information. And I spoke to the deputy coroner, told him my plight. He was very compassionate, very kind. And I told him, I said, I bet you're the only person in the office. I bet you don't have one other staff person. I said, but if you would take the time to go through your evidence room. I said, I have no idea if these are in a pill bottle. I don't know if they're in a box. I don't know if they're in an envelope. I don't know what they're packaged in. I said, but it would be small. It's 3 teeth. It's not going to be a shoebox. And I said, could you see if it got pushed behind somebody else's specimens or box or whatever? I don't know how you label this stuff. He goes, ma'am, we don't even have it on our inventory list. And I'm freaking out. I said, well, would you please take the time to look? And so he called me back 2 days later and he said, I have looked and they're not here and they're not on our inventory list. And then Dr. Bennett is trying to tell me that they don't keep an inventory list on any evidence that's submitted. And he said they only started that after I came in and asked for something. And I'm like, whatever. The coroner owns the funeral home in Basin, Wyoming. So then I thought, well, maybe they're at the funeral home. So I tried calling the funeral home and never did get a response. So then I called the deputy coroner back, and he suggested I call 911 dispatch because just by chance and circumstance, the coroner had retired. So I called the 911 dispatch. I didn't tell them why. I just said, I really have an urgent matter. I understand you can get a hold of Del Atwood for me. Here's my phone number. Would you please have him call me? He called me right back. He assured me he had never received the 3 teeth and that if they weren't on the inventory list and they weren't in the evidence room, he had never received them. But then he started asking questions that were, again, in my mind, not the right question. Well, how does her husband feel about this? Is he okay with the autopsy? Does he believe this is his wife? And I'm like, well, yeah, sure he does. First, he didn't identify the body. He refused to go identify the body. Second, he had a $250,000 accidental death policy taken out on her and got paid out on it. So why would he question the identity of the body? But those weren't the questions he was asking. He was making it sound like I was creating questions that were unnecessary.
Sticking your nose where it didn't belong.
Yeah, and that I was asking too many questions. So after that, my sister did some digging on Montana code, and supposedly, not that Mineral County has abided by this for anything else, supposedly for Montana code, if a case is considered open and active, they are not supposed to release any evidence. But they released all Rebekah's personal belongings to David in 2022, and Rebekah's case was still considered open at that time by the county attorney, not by the sheriff.
Okay.
My sister Laura said, if legally those teeth should have never been allowed to leave the state crime lab if they followed Montana code. So I reached out to the state crime lab. I did get a read receipt. I simply said, Tom Bennett says he doesn't have the teeth. The second autopsy says 3 teeth were pulled for future DNA forensics. By any chance, do you have them? Nothing accusatory, just trying to find out where they're at. No response. But I know they read it because I got a read receipt. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
No, you can't.
How many other missing people, their families get death threats, there's a roadblock to everything, and then when you finally think you're going to get an answer, the human remains are lost. And Gloria at MIDA typing, she said, do not let them minimize the importance of this. She said the teeth were taken from a dead body, which is a cadaver, and she said, and they are considered human remains. She said every time they try to avoid that label, they are trying to minimize. So It's been a journey.
Yes, it has.
It has been a journey. And all I know is that if, with the threats we have gotten and the interference we have got, if that had been targeted to a government official, every 3-letter agency in the United States would have been called in.
Yeah. Have you ever tried to reach out to any of the major news?
Yeah, nobody will touch it. News Nation did a piece on it in November of 21. We did say that we thought that, well, we didn't say it was connected. We just said Rebekah had been a victim with a history of domestic violence. And they were very quick to put in there that Mineral County Sheriff's Office had stated that domestic violence was not a consideration in this case. And then Dateline did a social media post, but they also left out domestic violence. I mean, they just left it out altogether. Trying to think. News Nation, Fox in Montana, they did a brief presentation. They were very quick to say Mineral County has said there's no connection of domestic violence with this case. NBC Montana tried really hard to cover it honestly, and the journalist ended up quitting. So I don't know what the correlation is there. Mm-hmm. And KPAX, Fagan Mannering, who has since moved out of state and gone on to something else, was probably the most consistent. She would follow up on a regular basis, and she would every time say about the PFMA charge and the history of domestic violence. But apparently Mineral County was very quick to say, because every time she ended it with, Mineral County says there is no connection between domestic violence and Rebekah missing. And I would like to know how they can say that with 100% confidence.
You're reading my mind, because that's what I'm thinking too, is with all of the evidence that is there, that is recorded.
Right.
And you say one doesn't have anything to do with the other. Well, maybe it doesn't, but would you not want to make damn sure
right
that one wasn't connected to the other by doing a thorough
right
investigation and looking into him and his background and everything? He should have been a person of concern immediately.
Right. And there was a case in Massachusetts. The woman went missing, and the husband purposefully tried to deflect the police department. It only took them 48 hours to figure that out. And they went back with a search warrant and confiscated that husband's laptop and all his digital equipment. And they found proof that he had been involved, and they've never found the body. But the man was sentenced.
But in this case, they took her laptop.
Yes, they took her laptop.
And they didn't take his laptop.
Correct.
They didn't do a search of his house?
No, only for the guns. They only did a search for the guns.
Okay.
And that was very search specific.
Okay. What is your next move? Do you want to say? Do you have a next move?
So we do have a next move. I've actually reached out to Kelson Young at the Montana Coalition. I hope to hear back from her soon. Jamie Rogers actually suggested that I reach out to the Montana Coalition. I would like Kelson Young's input and her suggestions and her guidance on reviewing the Slayer statute. According to the Montana Bar Association, the Slayer statute should have protected Rebekah from being returned to her abuser, even dead. It did not do that. My two attorneys felt like the Slayer statute only went into play on a conviction, but the Montana Bar Association representative said, no, it's supposed to encompass everything. So that leads me to believe that maybe there needs to be an amendment or a revamping of the writing of the Slayer statute if there's that much leeway in interpretation as to how it should protect the victim and what it should provide.
Yeah.
And then the other one was the Montana Code regarding separation of marriage. and that's Montana Code 40-4-104. And what I hope to successfully
40-4-104.
What I hopefully I can successfully coordinate with her the need to implement a clause in the Montana Code for separation in cases that involve domestic violence. And I understand that the domestic violence would need to be something that's documented. There needs to be if there's an active PFMA charge.
Yeah.
But if there's an active PFMA charge, if there's a documentation of recorded calls for domestic violence, the history of those situations would be taken into consideration on the 180-day requirement.
Okay.
And that the victim would be allowed to file for separation before the 180 days. Because since Rebekah didn't file, and she couldn't file because she hadn't fulfilled the 180 days, David was still considered next of kin. Now, some states are even worse. In the state I live in Virginia, it's 365 days. So I have some work to do in Virginia, too.
So what you're saying is they have to wait for a whole year before they can file anything?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Whether it's a separation, whether it's a dissolution?
Yeah.
When does the time start?
From the time they leave the home.
From the time they leave the home.
Mm-hmm. And so that's, as far as hoping to connect here in Montana, that is my primary goal. And I believe that there's more work to be done, so I believe more lives will be changed. I believe more families will become involved. I have to believe that.
Yeah.
That more families and more citizens of the community will take to heart how serious domestic violence is and the impact it has on society as a whole and the individual families.
I commend you for being able to do this. I can't imagine, the pain that you have been through. So being able to tell this story, that the message is a powerful message that you're giving. I believe with all my heart right now that we're supposed to be doing this.
Yes.
We're supposed to be getting this out in Montana.
Yes. In Montana, of course, my passion is Montana because that's where Rebekah's experience happened. And then, of course, being out here, that's where our experience happened. And yes, I hear so many stories of where, for lack of a better word, improvement is needed drastically.
Absolutely.
To protect the victims of domestic violence and not to victim shame them or victim blame them or to cast anything on the victim to say this was your fault.
Right.
And that happens. It's been my experience that happens often.
Very often, victims are re-victimized.
Yes.
Over and over by all of the different first responders.
Yes.
The ones that should be listening.
Yes.
And gathering information and gathering evidence and making sure that they have what prosecution needs and stuff.
Yes.
And instead of that, because of the lack of training, the lack of, a lot of times, caring, they re-victimize and they end up shutting a victim down.
Yes.
Because a victim, when you re-victimize them,
they shut down. They're done.
They're done.
Yeah.
When they get asked, well, what did you do to
initiate this or to cause this response?
And it's like, okay, here we go again.
Yeah.
They're done. They're done talking.
Well, and I recently had a conversation with Jamie Rogers, and she explained to me, I had asked about the lethal assessment program, lethality assessment program out of Maryland. And she said it was used here for a while, but it wasn't effective. I'm not really sure why it wasn't effective. She said now that there's a study for the Appraise program out of Arizona. Kalispell, Helena, and Missoula are the study points for that.
Okay.
But then in speaking to you, you also have a risk assessment program that you make available to law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question is this. It's not so much the lack of having the risk assessment, whether it's LAP or Appraise or your program, but it's needing to implement it at ground level.
Right.
And you can have all the tools in your trunk, but if you don't pull them out and use them when you need them and use them as they're supposed to be used, then they're not going to be effective.
No. And they're just going to sit there and rust.
Right. And so are the risk assessment programs not effective? And I'm going to blanket this statement based on my conversation with Jamie. Are they not effective because they're not being implemented? Are they in place in, if not all localities, a lot of localities and counties in Montana? But is it because there's lack of training and lack of implementation? Is that why they're not effective? And I don't know that you can answer that question, but to me, that's my first thought. I mean, as a nurse on the floor, if I need to assist in suturing up an incision made by a physician from a procedure, if I don't have all my tools laid out and they're not all sterile and they're not all ready to go and I don't handle it in the sterile technique to make it available to the physician, they are of no value.
Right.
They're not of any value.
And I think that's a really good comparison to what we're talking about. Is it's kind of like the old adage, you can lead a horse to water.
Right.
You can give it to them, you can offer it to them, but they've got to want to take it. They've got to want to say, you know what, I need to learn more about this.
Right.
And then it goes to, the deputies, the city officers and stuff say, well, this is a policy that the chief put into place or that the sheriff put into place. These are our policies. Well, maybe we should look at the policies again. Maybe there needs to be a change in your policy.
Right.
And how are you going to do that? You've got all kinds of resources that you could tap into.
Right.
Other agencies, find one that does work.
Yes.
And say, tell us what you're doing
Yes.
to make it work.
Yes,
I mean,
definitely.
there's so many things that are, I think, that are involved in it that nobody wants to touch.
They don't want to touch out of fear.
Yeah.
And really, I mean, the fear can either intimidate or it can motivate. I often wonder if we don't have to humanize our presentation to law enforcement, to attorneys, to the judges, and say, this could be essential in a case that involves your daughter, your son, your niece, your nephew, your wife, to personalize it.
Right, absolutely.
Because right now it's just, we need to do this for numbers and statistics and make reports and because somebody told us to. But if we personalize it and bring it home, so one way to bring it home, 1 out of 3 women have experienced domestic violence nationally.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
So that means in a group of 10 women, there have been 3 that have experienced it. Take it to your church.
Absolutely.
To your Bible study group.
Yeah.
You've got 10 women in your Bible study group. That means 3 women in that Bible study group have experienced domestic violence. Take it to your knitting circle or take it to your fire department or whatever. Bowling team, pool team, whatever. Personalize it.
Right.
Because it affects you, it affects your family, it affects your neighbor, it affects your community. And I think your motto on your cup, break the silence, that's so important because with domestic violence, and I have learned even with missing persons, there is a level of shame that comes with it. Domestic violence because the victim is going, how did I get here? And how do I get out without totally destroying this other person, especially if there's somebody who thinks they still love their partner, and has hope for the ability to set things straight and to be in a loving and kind relationship. How do you step out and ask for help without creating that? It's really a bubble of shame around you. Like, why are you there? People will say, well, why do you stay? You know?
Yeah.
There's a lot of reasons why people stay.
I can do a whole conference on why women stay.
Right. You know?
Hours of it.
Yeah. And typically it's the men asking the victim, why did you stay?
Yeah.
It's not the women typically asking, why did you stay? There needs to be an opportunity and a hunger for education to learn that there are many, many, many faces of domestic violence.
Yeah.
Like, I spoke to one friend of Rebekah's, and we spoke about the domestic violence, and their response to me was, well, you know, I never saw Rebekah black and blue, and they're in the medical field. And I'm thinking, wow, wherever you work, they need to do some more training, you know?
Yeah.
And I'm like, domestic violence isn't just physical. I said it's emotional, it's mental. I said it could be financial. I said it could be intimidation. It could be, you know, threats to their livelihood and their safety.
And their children.
And their children and their pets, their families. I said the list goes on and on. It doesn't have to be the black and blue marks that you see on the outside.
But that was how it was always judged.
Yeah.
And then it was, well, yeah, she's got bruises, and then you ask her about them, and she lies about it.
Yes.
Of course she does.
Yes.
So of course she does. She lies to the doctors about her injuries.
Yeah.
Because the perp is either sitting in the room, in the exam room, or he's sitting out in the car, and he has told her exactly what she's going to tell him.
Exactly.
You know, this cycle that has been going on forever.
Right.
Okay. When do we get to break the cycle? Am I ever going to be out of a job?
I know. Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah.
You know, in the state of Montana, if I remember correctly, intimidation and terrorism, and somewhere either under intimidation or terrorism is the other word, is a felony. But domestic violence is a misdemeanor.
Mm-hmm.
But domestic violence includes personal terrorism and personal intimidation.
Absolutely, yeah.
And
that's always been something that it is beyond, a lot of times beyond your understanding, is that the same person can go downtown to the bar, get in a bar fight, and be charged with a felony. Felony assault, just like that.
Right.
But they get to pound on their partners.
Right.
And they've got to be convicted before it's anything. They've got to be convicted twice before it can be charged as a felony. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of times it's still not charged as a felony.
Right. Right.
So what is wrong with this picture?
Yeah.
What is wrong with this picture? But we still have that law. And in some states, it says if a law enforcement is called to domestic, that they have to arrest somebody. In our state, it says arrest is the preferred procedure.
Mm-hmm.
And when I ask, why was there no arrest made? If there's not an arrest made, then you have to write a detailed report. So where's the report?
Right.
Most of the time, there's no report. And each law enforcement agency has their own policies, and they have their policy around how they are to respond to a domestic. Mm-hmm. Some are good, and some suck. You know,
right?
And it's like all you're doing is putting that victim in more danger by the way you are responding, or the way you're not responding.
Correct.
Is you're just putting that person in more danger every time. And pretty soon they're not going to call you anymore.
On reported cases of domestic violence in a chronological year, I was looking at a year span for Mineral County, and I did reach out to Jamie Rogers, and I said, where do you get these numbers from? And why is there such a decrease in cases reported? And she told me that cases reported is up to the discretion of the sheriff.
And they also have to call it if a call comes into dispatch, and the dispatch sends people out. I mean, I read this from the training at the Law Enforcement Academy. If this is domestic, it has to be written up as a domestic. If they call it a family disturbance, it's not written up as a domestic.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, it's written up as a family disturbance.
So then that particular call wouldn't fall under domestic violence.
That's what I'm guessing, is that wouldn't be reported under the domestic violence statistics that have to be reported to the state.
So then that's where the community at large needs to be educated, that if there is an issue and they have to call the police, do not call and say this is for a family disturbance.
Well, a lot of times
for domestic violence, they need to call it domestic violence.
Right. And whether that is due to the training of the dispatchers, that they call it that when they send out an officer.
That's a good point.
And they say there's a domestic in progress, or they're saying you need to respond to this address because there's a family disturbance. I can't answer that question.
I can't either, and I wonder how much training a dispatch officer gets in regards to calls and domestic violence issues.
That would be a good thing to find out. I've got dispatcher training, and I've done dispatch training before, and I know that after I spent 2 days doing dispatch training, and I think every one of them said, I will never be able to take another call and not understand, because they didn't understand. These people call every weekend. They are annoying. They fight every weekend because they drink every weekend. And so this is just, it's just the Joneses down the road fighting again. And they said, we will never be able to look at a domestic the same way as we did before, because they finally were given the reason why and what's going on, and why one of them may be hysterical and the next one may have just a flat effect, in their voice.
Right. So, and there is a difference, because like in Rebekah's case in the hearing for the PFMA against David, her attorney went through great lengths to point out that Rebekah appeared to be flat, calm, cool, and collected in her call to dispatch for assistance. And that if domestic violence was going on, in his opinion, the attorney's opinion, she would have been more hysterical, excitable, more elevated in her speech. And I do remember he asked the dispatcher on the stand, do you typically get calls with people calm, cool, and collected? And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, A, how much training has she had in domestic violence, and the psychology behind being the victim of a domestic violence situation and having the abuser standing right there while you're making the call.
All right. Yeah.
And I thought that was a very misleading question to ask.
Right, yeah. Because, everybody is going to act differently according to what has happened to them, what has happened in the past, their personality.
Right.
They might be one that is hysterical.
Right.
And again, then this can be used against them because, well, they were hysterical. I couldn't understand hardly anything they were saying. They were probably on drugs. Because somebody said they were probably on drugs. But you don't know that.
Right.
You don't know that, so why would you
say it?
Say it.
Why would you say it?
And so, you can't predict. Victims come into our office, and some come in so angry, and they are just beside themselves. They are so angry. And others come in, and they are so timid. To where, they don't make good eye contact. They are very careful about what they say because they don't know us. They don't really understand a lot of times what it is that we do until we explain to them what we do.
Right.
And that we're not there to judge. We're there to find out what they need.
Right.
And how can we help you through this?
Right.
So tell us your story as best you can.
Yeah.
And like I said, you get all kinds of different reactions.
Mm-hmm.
And none of them say, well, that person wasn't acting upset enough.
Mm-hmm.
Upset enough for what?
Right. Right.
You know, she walked in here with a broken arm,
Right.
and she's calm. Maybe she has her kids with her,
Yeah.
and so she's not doing anything to upset the children.
Right.
Right? I mean, there's so many scenarios that you could go through to say, well, she just was too calm for a domestic to be going on.
Right.
Tells me that person has never went through any training.
Correct. That would be my first impression as well.
Again, my opinion.
Yes. I don't know how this happened really, but the tribal liaisons, quite a few have just embraced Rebekah and embraced her story. Cheryl was the first one that, when I reached out to, she returned communication. And I was forever grateful because she said it doesn't matter about their origin or their race or their sex or their nationality. This is a human problem.
Absolutely.
She's on a task force this year, and she just texted and said, I shared Rebekah's story. This goes beyond our reservation. It's happening everywhere.
Yeah, it is. It is.
And so Cheryl's willing to talk about Selena, not afraid, who went missing several years ago and was written off as died from hypothermia, but no other investigation's been done. I think Selena is her niece. So I don't know. I mean, I'm just asking God where it's going to go. This isn't my trumpet to toot, or to blow on, but my sister just published a coloring book to teach safe and respectful communication skills to 4 to 8-year-olds.
I saw that.
Oh, did you?
I saw that on
Yes.
Facebook. Yeah.
And so she just published that, and I'm so proud of her for doing that.
Yes.
You know, I don't know. I wake up every day, and Colleen asked me last night, she goes, how much time do you need to get ready in the mornings? And I need about 3 hours to get centered and to get to a place where I'm not sad all day. I'm in a grief support group online by David Kessler, and he says to acknowledge your grief in the morning so it doesn't get in the way of what you have to do. And so I pray, I meditate, I listen to scripture, I sing or listen to worship songs and listen to meditation. And if I'm having a sad moment, I let myself cry. And I just remind myself I'm acknowledging my sadness so that it won't hinder what I need to do today. I just ask God to go before me. So, however he's going to, it's not a journey I asked for.
Yeah.
No bear would. When I was out in Montana living here, every month we held a vigil for Rebekah because nobody knew she was missing. The Montana Supreme Court accused me of becoming a domestic violence advocate for domestic violence and missing persons during those vigils. That was their opinion. But yet, I went back through every photo of every month. Every month we had posters and flyers. Rebekah's missing. Have you seen me? Rebekah's still missing. I'm like, well, if they want to misconstrue that as becoming an advocate for domestic violence and missing persons, so be it. But shame on them. I don't have a reason to do vigils for Rebekah anymore because supposedly a body's been found. But I do have a reason to continue to be an advocate for domestic violence and missing persons. And when I'm emotionally ready, I've signed up twice to take training with our local domestic violence organization, Safe Harbor, and twice I've had to renege because I just didn't feel like it's 40 hours. And I just didn't feel it's 40 hours spaced over 6 weeks, but you have homework.
Yeah.
And I just didn't feel like I was in a good spot where I could put myself in that. Yeah. So I'm trusting God will let me know when that time's right.
Yeah, I believe it will.
That doesn't mean don't need to do anything. So,
But maybe it's because he wants you to do something different.
Yeah.
But getting the same result.
Right.
And it could be doing what you're doing now.
Yes. I think that Rebekah's legacy so far has been a huge resource. It has been a resource of other organizations, a resource of other tools, a resource to give to people. Like on Rebekah's Legacy website, there's information about what you need to know about canine search and rescue organizations. When we had people who would come, God bless them. I mean, their hearts were in the right place. But they had dogs at home with no scent training other than a squirrel or a bear. And they would say, well, I can bring my dogs. They're great trackers. But enough time had passed that there was nothing to track.
Right.
Not in regards to Rebekah or anything that happened. And then there was a team of cadaver dogs in Mineral County that were offered. But unfortunately, the owner had gone through a tremendous trauma in his own life. And I don't know that the dogs had maintained certification.
Oh.
And it's very, very important that cadaver dogs are recertified on a regular basis. Some of the organizations out there don't consider that necessary. Some of your search and rescue teams at the local level don't understand the necessity to have your search and rescue dogs, your cadaver dogs, recertified. I think it's every 2 years is the max. That's the maximum length of time that you can go without getting a search and rescue dog recertified. I had one search and rescue team leader tell me, once they're certified, why should you have to retrain them? And I'm thinking to myself, sure, once I've gone through nursing school and I haven't used a particular skill in 6 or 8 months, why should I go to my team lead and say, can I take a refresher class that's scheduled for next week for 3 hours to make sure I know how to do this right the first time? And so, and my sister finds a lot of resources about the laws and legislation that are before the United States Supreme Court and webinars that are available for free, like through Light the Way. They recently offered webinars on press releases because the community, and myself involved, think that a press release can only come from the police department. And that's not true.
No, it's not.
But they don't tell you that. And even my attorneys didn't tell me. Right now, we're a great hub for resourcing. We're not a nonprofit yet. We would like to be someday because we think it would give us more credence, in the community. And someday we hope to be. Right now it's just my sister and I.
Well, if God will work that out.
Yeah.
Well, what would your message be at the end of this now? What would you like to say to those that are listening to this podcast?
Make sure you tell those around you you love them. Don't miss an opportunity. Don't think they're too busy. In today's age, you can text and leave a voicemail. But at least you can call or text and say, I love you. And take a deep look inside because we get so desensitized by what's on TV and think, how does that happen? And then the next morning you could wake up and it could happen to you.
Yes. And on that note, I thank you so much for all of the time that you have spent with us, and sharing your soul and your story is so important, and we will never forget her.
Thank you.
We are going to make sure that we never forget her.
Thank you.
Rebekah. Thank you.